Podcasters Roundtable, round 73, branding your podcast. So this topic stems from a question that I got on Twitter, and I don't have it pulled up at the moment, but essentially it was, someone was asking me, do I have a separate social media account, essentially a separate Twitter for my podcast than, say, a personal account? So I thought, that's actually a good question. I'm sure we've sort of hit on it here before, and I thought we'd turn it into a whole topic. So we have a new roundtabler today, so that's check, right? We got that checked off. But let's meet our co-hosts, Old Faithfuls. Daniel J. Lewis, welcome back.
Thank you very much. I'm from theaudacitytopodcast.com and happy to be here, even though I'm technically on sabbatical too.
Yeah, well, it's campfire conversation here. We're just chilling.
This is relaxing. This is
work.
fun. Exactly.
Work. Why am I cropped in the live? Killing me. The video guy is cropped. I don't. Hangouts, you're tripping me out. We do this on Google Hangouts on Air. If you're listening to the audio only version and you don't know what we're talking about, you can check out the live version. It's usually about the same time, Thursdays, every other week, 4:30 Pacific, 7:30 Eastern. podcastersroundtable.com/live. And you want to go there to sign up too, to get on the roundtable, to be a new roundtabler. We'll meet him in a second. But Dave Jackson, welcome back.
Yeah, Dave Jackson from the schoolofpodcasting.com. And not only can you come out to the website and sign up for the newsletter, but you can play What's Behind Ray, which is great. Nothing really this week, so it's kind of going to be a quick game of What's Behind Ray, but that is half the fun of coming live.
Yes. I need to pile up some stuff on the table. That means that's a great excuse for new gear. Thank you, Dave. I will order a whole bunch of stuff. Oh, wait. If you're watching the video version, if you're not, you have to go over this little handy dandy.
Nice.
Roman probably knows what that is. Speaking of Roman Castro, welcome to your first roundtable.
Thank you. This is exciting. So my name is Roman Castro. I do the Spear podcast. It's a podcast about spearfishing, and it's all under the Spearo Nation brand.
That's right. And if you look closely, again, a video feature, but I'll explain this one. If you missed it before, an audio version, people, sorry. I was holding up a small gimbal for a smartphone. A gimbal is a video device that uses a little motor to keep things balanced. You can move your hand around all you want. Camera stays completely balanced. It's not mine. It's for work, but I get to order it and play with it and learn how to use it. So hashtag dream job. But I am wearing Roman's brand right across my chest. Speaking of branding, if you don't see, it says The Spear. This is his shirt. And we'll talk a little bit about swag or having products for your podcast. And I met up with Roman in San Diego. It was cool. Right. We had a beer. He gave me a shirt. I wear it all the time. And if you want to be completely honest, sure, I'm supporting podcasting. It says podcast on it. And, Roman, I'll say the other day, someone was like, oh my gosh, what's on his shirt? And he was telling his son, because his son is like infatuated with fishing. I was
nice.
Hey, you got to check out the show. He likes everything fishing, right? And so, but I'll be honest, yes, promoting podcasting, promoting a friend, and Roman gave me the shirt, but it's a nice shirt. And so I think there's something to be said for not only like creating something that you're going to give somebody, but it has to be something they actually want to display, right? So a really poorly made item, if this was an ugly shirt, didn't fit well or something, I probably wouldn't wear it as much, but half the time I wear it because I just love the feel and it fits. And so it is, I'm telling you, it's out there and people are seeing it. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but cool. Let's start off. Let's light this fire with, we are having campfire conversation after all. Let's start the fire with, listen to me. I almost became an entrepreneur in that moment right there. I just talking about lighting fires and wow. It's branding. Oh, his branding works. Yep, I'm on fire. That's it. All right, let's ignite this round table. And by that I mean pour gas on it, just set it aflame. Daniel, do you have separate Twitter accounts for your podcasts? So we have probably have more than one show, a lot of us.
Yeah, so I host 3 podcasts myself, and I used to host a 4th one as well. And for most of the podcasts, well, now it's my clean comedy podcast, The Audacity to Podcast, and a podcast about the TV show Once Upon a Time. The comedy and podcasting stuff is very much me. So I do that through my one personal Twitter account. But the Once Upon a Time stuff is very different. It doesn't fit with the brand that I've spent years to build up. And so that podcast.
So wait, what is the brand you've spent years to build up?
Well, the brand, my personal brand, and that personal brand being podcasting with a touch of comedy here and there as well.
So I have a question. When you started out building your brand, was it an intentional thing to build a brand, or did you just want to do a podcast? Because here's the thing. I think that we have a definite division between people getting into podcasting now, because before I think people had a passion. They heard about podcasting, just wanted to share it, even before they even thought, oh, I'm going to build a brand and do this thing, right? But now you have a lot of businesses that are starting podcasts. You have a lot of business people, marketing people. All these people want to start a podcast and they're thinking a brand first. So I'm curious about how that worked for you. What order?
For me, it was I started Twitter with just whatever username I had at that time, which was actually the name of my business.
Not Daniel 478213.
No. And then I really wish I could have gotten a different username that's been dormant for half a decade.
I'm in the same camp. Let's talk about that for a second then. You wish you had your name. Me too.
Yeah.
Twitter doesn't allow us to get those even from dead accounts. And so, why? Obviously, you wanted to be yourself, right? Because you were saying you were starting it as a personal account.
Well, yeah, but I didn't really think about personal branding or what the long-term branding would be that I'd want. I was just thinking, this is a username I use in other places, so I'll use that here. And then when I started the Ramen Noodle podcast, then I changed my Twitter handle over to the Ramen Noodle. And then that's just what stuck for many years.
And so then the podcast, so Twitter before the podcast?
No, the Ramen Noodle was the name of the podcast. So I switched, I think it was just a few months after I joined Twitter that I started a podcast. Yeah, that is because of connecting with other people that I was inspired to start a podcast. So I changed the name of the Twitter handle to the name of the podcast, the Ramen Noodle. And I've kept
why
that.
did you do that? Why did you do that?
Because I thought it would be cute. I thought it would help promote my podcast if my Twitter handle was the name of my podcast. But very few people have asked why that Twitter handle, but almost everyone smiles at it, so it's hard to let it go. Now, though, I really wish I'd chosen something more universal, and I will be changing that branding very soon, pending certain things, and we'll see how that goes. But my other podcast, my Once Upon a Time podcast, does have its own Twitter account because there's enough content relevant to Once Upon a Time viewers that it justifies having its own Twitter account and not mixing that in with my personal branding that I've built up over these years.
And so Dave, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing with Twitter? Because I think in the pre-show you mentioned something about, having multiple accounts and the issues that brings up.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I'm almost in the same camp as Daniel. I have at Dave Jackson. And at the time, all the stuff on that Twitter was about music marketing, because that was my podcast, and then it started to be about podcasting, and everything was going out over that one thing. And I'm like, well, not everybody wants to do this, because I have a weight loss show, I have a web design show, and it just didn't mix. So I went and created all these separate accounts for the show, which was cool. But that then creates, you don't want people to go to your Twitter account and see like nothing but a bunch of tumbleweeds basically. And so then it was a matter of, okay, now I've got to put things on this feed besides come listen to my latest episode. And so that took a lot of work. So I know for the Logical Weight Loss podcast, I rarely ever I don't even tweet I have a new episode out. It just sits there and does nothing. Most of those are just sitting there doing nothing. And then I really wish that I want to go back to using @DaveJackson as my main Twitter, because I switched to @LearnToPodcast because I was like the Joe Podcast guy, but it's one of those things now. I think I should go back to @DaveJackson and do my podcasting thing over there. That's basically, I am so much now at this point associated with podcasting, I'd rather have it do that way. And if later down the road I were to ever pick up a new hobby or whatever, well then those people that are following me are like, well, he's talking about whatever now, and they're going to unfollow me, and the new people will follow me. I think I just keep going at this point, and those that want to follow you will follow, and those are like, I'm tired of this guy and his whatever, will unfollow me. But it was a lot of work to find content to keep it going.
Yeah, and that sort of speaks to one of the things that I'm most interested in, and that is, as podcasters, we produce content that we hear all the time is a little bit more intimate, it's a little bit more personal. We have the ability, because we have a podcast and as much time as we want to burn and freedom to say anything we want, to share more of ourselves on a podcast. And that's where part of that connection happens, right? People might find your podcast for the content, and then they stick around because they're like, I like this guy. So what about just having a Twitter account for you, since you are almost synonymous with your podcast? You are the brand, right? When you start a show. So I'm really curious about that divide. I myself have, I'm at Podcast Helper on Twitter, and one of these things was, like Daniel, I could not get my name. It was taken, and therefore I needed a moniker. But I actually switched, originally it was a Produce Picker podcast account, and that just made no sense when I was doing podcasting stuff, and those people didn't want to hear it. I do like your idea of, hey, people they'll come in and out of your feed, essentially, right? Because they're like, this isn't the content I want, or if it starts being the content they want, maybe they'll come back and follow Dave Jackson. So I do have to have sort of a moniker for mine. But, Roman, what about you in terms of, you've built a really, I think I've seen it over the last year or two, your brand has really evolved. And did you start off, what were you doing before you were podcasting? I'm assuming, when did you start?
So I started a blog actually in 2011.
Okay, right, so were you already on Twitter at that time? We're using Twitter specifically, but we can talk about anything else.
Yeah, I had at Roman Castro on Twitter, and then at the time a spear fisherman is called a Spiro, right? So I started spiroblog.com, and I got that Twitter account. And about, I don't know, in 2014, after like some growth of me just sharing like the beginnings of how to become a spear fisherman, I decided I wanted to learn more from more seasoned guys by interviewing them. So that's when I started the show. And with that show, that became the Spear Podcast. And then I had like disjointed things, right? I had like the Spear Podcast on one side, I had Spiro blog handle, and I had Roman Castro as my personal account. So about a year ago, I went ahead and tried to unify the whole thing under Spiro Nation. And at that point, I switched my Spiro blog account into Spiro Nation. And then everything kind of seemed to work together at that point. Everybody in the industry at least saw that, hey, it's not a podcast, it's not a blog, it's a kind of a brand all mixed together into one thing. So it kind of helped me grow as far as that goes. So
yeah, I want to make I want to make a point here that if you're noticing a theme, it's that we have a vast continuum of podcasters on this show. We're all still struggling with branding. Look, you have two very experienced podcasters. One has an award for his show. Okay, wave it there, Dan. But and that's your cue, Daniel. There you go. go vote in the podcast awards.
I like how
Daniel needs two. But hey, we are still all figuring this out after 10 years. I mean, you had these two guys are talking both about switching their brands essentially, or pieces of their brand and how it appears externally, at least on social. So it's very interesting. And, how about with like things like email? Like, do you have your domain as your email address? I always say that that's an easy way to promote your podcast, right? Not only to me, it appears that much more professional than just having it be at gmail.com, which I don't really think gets in the way, but it certainly just looks a little better. And it's cleaner and it's easier to remember, and it tells people what your show is when it's Ray at thepodcasterstudio.com, or in this case, I do have Ray at podcastersroundtable.com. So, I mean, do you guys, Roman, what's your email? Is it Roman Castro Gmail?
I actually haven't used a Gmail account in forever. I only use it to log into things like this, and my main email is going to be Roman at spironation.com or Roman at romancastro.com. So those are my two main email addresses. And again, I use them depending on what I'm working on. So I've been messing around with blogging lately. So that is all in the at Roman Castro domain, right? And then what I've been doing, since people have been kind of digging the podcast, I've been kind of trying to like connect with them even more by releasing like kind of behind the scenes, kind of like what I've been doing, how I get the podcast done. it adds a little bit more to the whole mix.
What about you guys, Daniel, Dave? How do you guys use a branded email? Do you think that's any use or?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of use your own domain, especially for your email too. Don't tell people whatever name of your podcast at gmail.com. It's fine if you make it forward to Gmail and if all your replies come from Gmail, but it sounds so much more professional and looks so much better branded if you have your own .com for your podcast and you use that for your email address. And then, especially if you then make something like media at myawesomepodcast.com and you use that email address when you're working with agencies or you're trying to get press passes or something. I've worked with a podcaster before and they requested press access to something. They were denied. Then they used a media at email address and they were accepted. All they did differently was a different email address.
Appearances are everything.
Yeah, I think email especially can, to a certain extent, like if it was Gmail, not the most professional, but right? But if that was an AOL account, that has a whole different kind of set of baggage with it.
Yeah, unless you're doing Today in AOL. And that's a show.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great example of, or if somebody said Hotmail or whatever, or come find me on my MySpace page, there would be things people like, what?
Again, and it really goes to, even beyond branding, Daniel, you speak to this often, it's just about making things easier, right? And they say, creating less friction or whatever marketing term they use. But because it's easier to remember. If people know your show, then it's more likely they're going to remember the .com or the Twitter handle. I'm curious, do you think more people know now from the people who, have to choose one or the other, do more people know your name or your show? So they're like, if they see you and they're like, oh, I know Daniel from the Audacity podcast, that'd be both. Or do you think you know your name, or is it more likely they remember your show? Like I think a lot of people know my name because of YouTube and may associate me with my show. So it's interesting how a brand sort of gets stuck to you, even if you're creating one thing, people are going to remember something else. Maybe, do you say are you constantly introducing yourself on your podcast, or, are you interacting with your audience? Do they know you on a first name basis, or do they kind of just know the show?
I know I personally know people's podcast, and then I'll be like, oh, it's the such and such show person thing, and then you sit there and go, wait, it's something with a D, it's Doug, Dave, Danny, something, wait, hold on, it's, and then that person like, it's Danny, you're like, yes, you're right, your name is Danny, good job, what does he win? So I know go ahead.
For me, it's the other way around. For the podcasts I listen to, I know both the name and the host. But for the people I know who listen to my podcast, I know their names more than I know their shows. So I feel bad sometimes to ask them when I see them at Podcast Movement or somewhere else. I have to ask them, remind me again, what's your show? What's your show about? Because sometimes I forget that, but I do remember their name and their face. I think that to them, that's probably more important than my remembering their show.
Yeah, that would be the way to go. As the old thing, I forget, there's an old sales book that says the most important thing to a customer is remembering their name. So yeah, that would be good.
Awesome. Yeah, we had a couple. Oh, go ahead, Roman.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm not as popular as you guys.
It's again the perception. It's just perception.
Yeah,
you probably
right,
are.
right.
You probably are.
But for the most part, I remember most of my listeners, like their names and stuff, and people that email me, and it's a cool experience. I had my first. I went to a convention following the advice of Glenn the Geek from Dave's show, and I got recognized a couple of times, and that was super cool. And some of those guys that had been listening to the show had never emailed me before or anything like that. So it's kind of a cool insight I got, that sometimes the listeners are out there that just don't take the time to email you, but they really appreciate your show, and it's something that I had kind of not experienced before. So it's kind of a cool thing to experience.
What about, do you guys have? I'm wearing Roman's shirt, but do you guys have stuff for your show? I have Podcast Roundtable stickers. If you ever see me, remind me, because I think I have some in my wallet.
Nice.
But stickers, even stickers, then people feel compelled to like put it on their stuff. So I'm sorry. Look, there's one. Daniel has it on.
Yeah.
I try to cover the Apple logo
Uh-huh.
on my MacBook with the Podcasters Roundtable
I
sticker.
should have made it bigger. Why? I mean, why? You don't have to do that. You're not beholden to. This isn't TV. You don't have to hide.
It's when I record videos. So here's a branding thing.
All right.
When I
That's cool.
record videos, and if my computer is in the video, I should be careful what logos appear in the video, so that the company won't be confused as endorsing or product placement or anything like that. Maybe it's not necessary.
Probably not for the
anymore
web.
in
You see this
day.
on TV all the time,
Yeah.
right? And they always have the placard that covers the Apple logo.
Or the Apple logo is shown very prominently, depending
Right.
on the show. But I just thought, well, instead of showing a logo, and I do like Apple products, so it's not like I'm trying to hide it. It's that instead of showing that, I'd rather show something that is more important or more relevant. It's something that fits the overall branding better and doesn't make it seem like I'm doing this for Apple.
Well, speaking of his shirt, I'm dying to know, where did you get that shirt made?
I got it made here at a local company.
Okay.
It's not. It's screen printed. It's a nice quality shirt. Again, it's one of those things where I wanted to go all out with my show, and I know a lot of podcasters won't spend the money to make nice shirts or hold inventory or get like stickers made, right? This kind of stuff. It's like the equivalent to having your own URL and your email address. It adds a different level, right?
Well, here's the thing too. Like you have to pay for all that, and it's not necessarily being paid for, right? So some podcasters, and it doesn't have to be a marketing thing. It doesn't have to be like it's a nice thing for your community, right? It's like, hey,
Right.
thanks so much for listening. Like, here's a sticker, and yeah, it brands you and it puts you out there, but not even trying to do it for that reason. It can be just a fun thing to have. I think. Let's see, Sharky James in the chat. He said, "Do T-shirts move the needle?" He says, "Not so much, but they're fun."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean,
So, Roman, do you give away the T-shirts or do you sell them?
So when I first started, I would give them to only the people that were guests of the show or had helped the show in a significant way, like helping me promote it or just, kind of like friends of the show. And then I opened it up to anybody. So like they're available for sale, and they're basically I'm selling them at cost. So that's what I do for branding. And another way that you get a shirt is it's like I think it's a $10 level on Patreon. I'll send you a shirt too. So it's kind of
that's
just
nice,
like a cool way to do it, Same thing with the stickers. Like all the different Patreon levels will have different perks you get with them. Some of them are shirts. Some of them is a shirt. One of them is stickers, that kind of stuff. I think the one of them is like a phone call too. So
Nice. Well, I know Harry Duran from Podcast Junkies at Podcast Movement brought this big giant box of bright yellow T-shirts with his logo on it. It's just Podcast Junkies. And all of a sudden, you just started seeing these yellow shirts pop up everywhere, and you're kind of like, "What's a podcast junkie?" So it was a cool little branding way. And then he finally got everybody, or at least a lot of the people that got a T-shirt, into one big giant picture. So there was this big hive of bees there with this big giant yellow stuff. But now that yellow. Now I was in Dick's Sporting Goods, and there was a bright yellow Nike shoe with a black swoosh on it, and I was tempted to take a picture and go, "Harry, did you get your own brand of shoe?" Because it looked like a podcast junkie shoe.
Speaking of T-shirts and branding, and part of this here, I think that could be difficult for some podcasters is deciding what to put on the shirt. Because, if you're giving the shirts away, then having your logo or your podcast name or something like that on the shirt can make total sense. It's a token of your appreciation for their involvement, that kind of thing. But I think to sell, the people who would want to buy a T-shirt that simply says your podcast name are only going to be those die-hard fans that would give you money if you fart in a jar. And people do that.
I'm not giving you money.
Wow.
Like it's not a
Rhett and
Patreon
Link.
reward. I'm
Rhett and Link
I'm not doing it.
did something
Yes,
like
Rhett
that, actually.
and they're awesome. Now that is, dude. How strong is your brand? If people will,
Yeah.
Well, so maybe what you could do, and I think the Podcast Junkies thing kind of hits on a nice hybrid of this. If you want to sell a shirt, maybe what you could do is have something that not only represents your brand, but also represents them in some way. So like a t-shirt, Harry is getting all kinds of coverage here. A t-shirt that says podcast junkies. I mean, that means I'm a podcast junkie. I'm representing myself as well as representing him.
Right.
So it's that kind of balance maybe to find. So maybe it's not simply your show logo, but something funny that your audience will enjoy wearing.
Well, look at the Libsyn t-shirts.
I was gonna say I need
Yeah.
to go grab one out of my
Dave,
closet.
where's your shirt, buddy?
Yeah.
But it just says hashtag podcasting, right? So it's just a,
Nice.
Well, it
but
says-
it does
it
say
says-
Libsyn on it.
It says podcaster in big giant
Podcast.
letters, then a hashtag Libsyn. So
Oh, cool.
Or the Spreaker t-shirt says I love podcasting in really big letters, and then underneath it says Spreaker.
Right.
Yeah, so basically anybody could take that and do something for their own topic. So like for me, it's spearfishing. I do some spearfishing scene or some well-known funny spearfishing thing, and just like hashtag it or tag it.
Right, and any fellow spearfishing nerd is going to recognize and be like, "That's a cool shirt.
Yeah.
Where'd you get it?" And now you've opened up the conversation, right? Even without having, you don't have to have your brand there because it's going to, for the people who you actually want it to reach, they're going to probably have that conversation. I've had this happen all the time, and I've had it happen with this shirt. I've had it happen in airports with a dig shirt, or I think a Dig Nation shirt, and you get that person that recognize, they be like, there's like only one person, and when you take a trip 3,000 miles away, and there's one person who looks at you and you're like, yeah, buddy, and then you're talking. So it's also bringing the community together. It's a lot more than marketing, but it's also a bit of pride to wear in your sleeve and be like, I am also a listener. So related to the social media and having the social media, that sounds so someone who doesn't do social
the
media.
internets, yes.
The internets, the podcasters, websites. Do each of your shows have their own website, or do they all live on like DaveJackson.com? For me, I know I have RayOrtega.com. That's really a hub that you can get everything I do online. But of course, this show, podcastersroundtable.com, the podcasterstudio.com has its own show. I spun off Podcast Quick Tips, can't say the name of my own show, and also put that on the Podcaster Studio because it was sort of just like a little sister show of the Podcaster Studio. So what about you guys when it comes to websites? Are you breaking that out, or are you putting it all under one banner? Daniel, you have a network, so how does that work?
Yeah, my approach is everything pretty much has its own website. All of my podcasts have their own website. The network has its own site. Why?
Yeah.
So that each one of them can have very strong branding. When I first launched the network, it was also in conjunction with launching the Audacity to Podcast, which was my third podcast at that time. So 3 podcasts on the same website. And what I was running into is the branding and marketing mix-up of those 2 sites. Like someone would go to the site looking for podcast 1, but they see podcast 2 and 3 because podcast 1 hasn't had an episode in 2 months.
All right. So since you just said those words, I have to interrupt, and this is what we do. Let's take a quick podcast 1. I was watching the NBA finals or something, and they're talking, hey, Shaq has a podcast, podcast1.com. Whoa, what? No, they're sending me to podcast 1, and they do that. They have a lot of shows, right? And I bet all of those podcasters, they all have to tell people their website is Podcast One,
Just One,
not even the name of their own show.
Oh,
Go to this.
That hurts me. That hurts my brain.
Well, and the sad thing is if you don't have enough numbers, Norm will whack you quickly. If you don't believe me, ask Jillian Michaels, Kathy Lee Gifford, and Ice-T, and Dee Snider. So
You're probably the better. Well, then they get to launch the show. It probably is doing fairly well, and now they can create their own website with their own brand and say, go to the
which is
big
exactly-
show with Shaq, right?
yeah, that's what I know Ice-T does. He has his own website now, keeps it going, and
So, Norm, if you want to bring the Podcasters Roundtable on, all right, we'll put some big money behind it, and then we'll just, if you feel free to cut us in 6 months to a year, we'll be fine.
That's kind of similar to what Rob Walsh says about SoundCloud, is that SoundCloud is interested in your building SoundCloud's brand, not your building your own brand. And I think it is important for every podcaster to build their own brand. However you figure out what brand it is that you're promoting, personal site or network site or podcast site, but building your own, and then you can take that anywhere, even if it's a domain that points to a WordPress.com.
Yeah, and for me, I'm always pointing at stuff. So if it's like, whatever, schoolofpodcasting.com/hosting, if I had some sort of other thing, they'd be like, oh, go to whatever, powerofpodcasting.com / whatever. And just, to me, I want to have every website so I can have my own thing that I do a lot of redirects.
Well, and think about this in terms of our show. When we're in our show and we're like, hey, go to twitter.com/podcast helper. And then when you're done, go over to podcastersroundtable.com and then hit us up on facebook.com/I love the podcast. Like, oh my gosh, right? How many brands are you putting out? People are like, I don't know where to go and I'm out of here, right? So it really can help to make that brand just one solid, consistent place, or at least probably at that point you want to limit your call to action, right?
I do that with interviews now. When at the end of the interview, if they ask me that question, where can we find out more about you, connect with you on Twitter, all of that stuff, I just say, it's all at theaudacitytopodcast.com. I might mention you can get this product, this, that. You can follow me on Twitter from there, but it's all, the only actual place I give them is theaudacitytopodcast.com. Now, I want to continue, though, the question you were asking, Ray, and throw it to Dave, because Dave, you have a network, you have your personal site, and your content is in different places and it's similar content. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, one was an accident. Seriously, I've always had the School of Podcasting, and before I had the School of Podcasting, I had, and I don't even remember my own website. How sad is that? davidjackson.org. And I was playing with WordPress on that. I was like, oh, cool, this is fun, blah, 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 and started putting a couple posts on there. And then I built the School of Podcasting and was like, okay, cool. And one day I went to Google and typed in podcasting, and I was in competition with myself. In fact, my blog, which I'd kind of abandoned, was ranking better than the School of Podcasting. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to kill that if I'm ranking for it. I'll go ahead and, as long as I'm beating myself, I'll be more than happy to lose an SEO for that. So that's one. davidjackson.org is only there because I started to rank really well, and it still does for a fair amount of terms. So that's that. The power of podcasting came about because people would eventually hear that, hey, I thought you just did the School of Podcasting. No, I do weekly web tools, I do this and that. And people are like, well, why don't you talk about that on your show? I'm like, because I don't want to talk about weight loss on my podcasting show. So I just created the Power of Podcasting Network, in quotation marks, which is basically just a site there where you can go and read about each show, and then I have subscribe links. I think I have a player there, and so that's what that is there for. It's just, and all I do is every episode I play, this show is brought to you, or this show is part of the Power of Podcasting Network at powerofpodcasting.com. And so that's just there. So if somebody wants to find more stuff about Dave, there it is.
That you hinted at something there in networks, and that's come up a couple of times. Roman, have you had the opportunity to join a network, or you have your own network? What's your status there? Just a show?
So,
how's it work?
So it's just a show for now, but I've actually considered. I've actually redone the logo to start the Spear Nation Network. It's going to be a podcasting network about spearfishing related topics, and maybe open it up to other people to host their own shows. But it's. So I had to bring it up for a second. I'm gonna take it back to the original question, which was, do you have a website for each show? And since I'm thinking about starting a second show, a part of that Spear Nation network is I usually just buy the URLs and I'm running them all off of one self-hosted WordPress site. That's how I run the show, and then that's for everything to do with spearfishing. And then I have the Spear Nation site, which basically is a video describing what other shows are and what all the different sites that I run do with all the links. That's the way I set it up, and that's where I send people when they ask which site to go to. So.
Something I do, two examples that I'll use here. I have my personal blog, danielJlewis.com, which, talking about branding and trying to get your name, that took me 12 years to get that. I finally have it. I am very happy. And now I might change it. No, but DanielJLewis.com is my personal site, my personal blog. So that's where I write about, if I want to write something general about business or marketing or something motivational in some way, I write it there. If there's anything podcasting related, the art of creating a podcast, that is, it goes on the Audacity to Podcast, whether it's a video, an audio, a blog post, anything like that. On my personal blog, I might sometimes write about the favorite podcasts I listen to. And I did that in our episode a couple months ago. We talked about, let's all make a blog post featuring several great podcasts. And I did that. That was on my personal blog because it's not about podcasting. It's about podcasts. But another podcast I have, the Once Upon a Time fan podcast, that TV show had a spin-off TV show called Once Upon a Time in Wonderland. And they designed it to appeal to the exact same audience. So what we did is we wanted to cover that spin-off, and we knew that it was very likely our audience would also listen to that podcast and also watch that show. But we didn't want to assume all of our audience would want to do both. So we created a spin-off podcast, but hosted it on the same website because it's all part of the Once Upon a Time universe. And it appeals to the same audience. And it made sense to have those two podcasts because they were 100% relevant to each other, running on the same website, but separate feeds, separate iTunes listings, separate sections on the site.
That's sorry to jump in here, but that's exactly what I'm trying to do with that second show. It's a spin-off of this show. It's basically a shorter version of a segment, which is like 3 pointers. So yeah, I'll be running it on the same site, and of course, the people that already listen to the show will kind of are on that same topic. So everything to do with spearfishing is on that first site, and then I have my RomanCastro.com or anything else that's like stuff that I'm into. Right? It could be video, it could be other stuff too. So.
Brandy in the chat says, own website equals own spotlight. You own the spotlight. In my opinion, it's a must. So again, about joining networks, Daniel, you run a network. What's the advantage, from a branding perspective? I'm giving up a little bit of my brand when I join a network, right? I now have to promote the Noodle Mix network, or what's the name of the network, Daniel?
Noodle Mix, yeah.
Noodle Mix, yeah.
And that's something that with everyone who joins the network is I tell them, your branding is first and foremost. That is very different from other podcast networks. You'll hear the network branding first. You hear a pre-roll sort of thing. This is whatever network or that kind of thing. I tell them, don't do that. Put that kind of branding in the middle or put it near the end, mix it in somewhere. I want your branding first. And even I'm redesigning some of the cover art for our podcasts, and I'm even downplaying the branding there too. It's been before a Noodle Mix banner or bar at the bottom of the cover art. That's changing to be a simple little icon for the network that will be in the same place on every podcast cover art to make it even cleaner looking, as well as focusing more on their brand, because I want to give them the freedom that if at some point down the road we decide that it doesn't work for them to be on the network, that they can take their brand, take their audience, and there are certain stipulations in our contract about what they own and what I own, but they can take their brand, basically, and their audience with them, and they don't have to worry about losing that.
Yeah, and that's cool. That's good for your network because you understand that importance, and you're a podcaster. Dave, when it comes to thinking about your brand and, I have a chance to join a network, I have a YouTube channel that does okay, and weekly I get these emails that people that to join their multi-massive net, whatever these things are, right? They just send them out and say, hey, you're getting some views, we want you to join. And I've heard nightmare stories about joining those networks and getting signed to 2-year contracts, and then your content is, partially under control of someone else. So as a podcaster, did you ever have to think about, do I want to join a network versus do I want to just keep it my brand and not exchange some branding for views or listens, I guess?
Yeah, I've never had that opportunity. That's one thing. I've never had somebody say either A, can I join your thing, or the closest thing I've had.
Would you join a network?
What
would make you join a network? What would keep you away from a network?
Well, A, like you said, I have to be able to come with my content and leave with it. I've got to, all I want is more views. I want more listeners, so I'm willing to promote maybe other shows on the network as long as they're willing to promote me, as long as it doesn't become distracting to a certain extent. At the end, if you want me to play a quick 30-second clip of some other show, I'm willing to do that if they're willing to do the same thing for me. So I think that would be it. And then if for some reason there's money involved with that. Hey, as part of the network, we're going to run ads. Great. What's the percentage of income for the network versus the percentage of income for me? That would be something I would want to look at.
So from a brand perspective, here's an interesting thing. There's been a bit of a shakeup in the podcasting space with Stitcher being acquired, and even Stitcher itself is a bit controversial because they, in some way, inject their own brand, right? And different podcast directories, depending on who you syndicate to, have varying levels of control over your content. In Stitcher's case, they actually ingest your file, and they will insert their ads that you have no say in over your content. So you're making a decision: do I want to be available to the Stitcher audience, or do I not want Stitcher to have any involvement in my content, right? So what about that? Is there any kind of branding considerations that you guys make when syndicating? Are you on Stitcher? Are you on Google Play? Right? There's a little bit of issue with Google Play.
Well, I'll give you an example of something like that. I am on Stitcher, but I do a show. I just did it. In fact, I'm actually going to, I believe, officially podfade it here shortly. It's called the Clamor Cast, and it's where I like the Clamor app, and the whole fun of it is it's the top 20 things that people have liked on Clamor. And I listen to it, comment it, and go. But the bad news is I have zero control over the content, and there are times when it's really not something that I want associated with my brand. And so that's been one of the hardest problems of that, and the fact that there are times when I'll put out an episode and it's my witty banter that's supposed to make it, listenable, and it's just, I've got nothing to work with. And other times it's been great, but it's just one of those things that because I have no control over the content, I'm not super crazy about that. I'm too much of a control freak, and maybe that's half the fun of it. But on the other hand, where every other clip is F-bomb this and that, I'm like, I'm not sure that really is what I want associated with. And it doesn't mean Clamor is bad or this, and it's not something that I was like, not sure I want to really tie myself to this kind of content.
Yeah, and I mean, in a way, the way you formatted your show, you set yourself up for little choice in that you're going to select from whatever ranks, right? So you kind of put yourself in a corner with, well, number 5, I can't skip it. It's number 5, yeah. Right? Yeah. And you could always adjust if you wanted to, but my opinion is they should be paying you to do that show anyways. That's total promotion for their brand, and it's a good show. They should have bought that up right from the start. But Jason Olivio in the chat says, Olivo, I think I said that wrong. All right, sorry, Jason. He says, after trying to shrug off Blog Talk, I'm hesitant to join the network. So Blog Talk would inject like Blog Talk Radio, like in the beginning. I don't know if they still do that.
Yeah, I think so.
Right. So the thing is, like, just recently someone asked me about creating a call-in show, and Blog Talk, no one makes that easier than Blog Talk. So at some point you're exchanging, right, something for another. You're like, well, I'm willing to accept a little branding. I mean, especially if they're doing like free stuff for you, for the capability, which may be more important to you to get your guest into the show via phone than it is to, you're like, I'm cool with giving Blog Talk a little shout out there. Roman, you look like you're itching to say something.
No, I'm good. I was just thinking, like, for me, it's always been about having absolute control over my show, and it might be like overprotective of it, but like,
I don't think so.
I don't see the. I guess I'm ignorant to the benefits of joining a network besides maybe more rapid growth, right? And initially, when I first set up my show, that was alluring to me because, again, it would mean I grow my audience quicker. But since I've done it all kind of gradually and slowly, I don't think for me, it's not worth it. Like, I would just continue on. If you're a new podcaster and you're kind of eager to grow your audience, just keep going one show at a time. It's like joining a network might help you grow your audience, but then again, you're going to give up a little bit of that control. You're going to give up a little bit of your space, right? So.
And Jason makes a good point about Blog Talk in that if you pay for it, you can turn it off, and I think that's fair. Yeah. Like, it's premium. Like, we need to survive. So if it's really so intrusive, then hey, pay for an account, and you don't have to have it's sort of white label at that point, right? Where you get to promote only your brand. So Dave says all the time, like, free is not a good business model, right?
Well, and the problem, and it still kind of is for Blog Talk Radio, is their audio quality for years has been caca poo-poo. And they do have a beta program where you can get in and get better quality. I think because they have some big names over there at Blog Talk now, but I think you have to ask still to be on the beta program where you get the CD quality stuff.
And that was another issue with Stitcher one of the issues is that they take your brand. So part of my brand is built on quality, right? If you listen to my show, you care about how your podcast sounds and always trying to improve that. And so if you listen on Stitcher, they take my audio, they crush it down to 32 kilobits a second, and it sounds like garbage. It's not what I'm delivering, and that's a big part of my brand. Now, I'm still on Stitcher because people will choose a directory, and that's where they'll get all their podcasts. It's not like they're going to listen to some on Stitcher and some on iTunes. So if you're not there, then they just can't find you. And to me, that's no good. And, my theory is that if they're listening on Stitcher, they don't care. They don't either notice or don't care, right? Or they would go somewhere else. So it doesn't hurt my brand from a quality perspective, but that can be an issue. And that's one of the things that Stitcher, does that some people don't care for. I don't care for.
That's something that some podcasters have been able to request, that Stitcher just pass through and serve the files directly from the server.
And you can opt out of, exactly. There are things you can opt out of. We're not telling the whole story here. I'm using examples, but yes, you're right.
But now that Midroll, or Scripps, the parent company of Midroll, Scripps, Cincinnati-based company, by the way, now that they own Stitcher, I have more hope for Stitcher to see it become something even better now and more standard for the podcasting space.
Yeah, I mean, it was really weird. Like, they bought Stitcher, but didn't Deezer own Stitcher? So they really bought it from Deezer? I don't know. Anyways, we don't want to get into that. But it's weird things. But, the most important thing here is that there's a lot of stuff happening in podcasting every week these days. It's like top news. Dave, you had a show where it was big news that someone started a podcast. Now all the big news is over what brand is going to get into podcasting and who's buying who and who's launching a network. And so, hey, it's a good time. If you're in it right now, it's a good time to be a podcaster. A caca, a poo-poo.
Yeah, that is a podcasting term if you're listening to my show.
That's part of Dave's brand. Is unique brand. Yeah, unique Dave-isms. Like a caca, a poo-poo. Like, I know how to say that properly because I listen to a caca, a poo-poo, not just caca, poo-poo.
What do you think about changing brands as you go along? Like,
it's a tough question because even what you're talking about, like you mentioned in the chat that you are considering like a pseudonym, but Daniel J. Lewis is too well known. Not only that, it's so baked in to your catalog. If we're just talking about podcast, it's so baked in. It's baked into this show. So when you go backwards and you get confused because you just found the show and you're like, wait, who's Daniel J. Lewis and who's this thing? Like, it's a very serious consideration when rebranding, right?
Well, and I'm not talking about doing a personal rebranding, but like, what if you want to change your show? We've seen this. Some people rebrand their shows, change it to a completely different show, change the topic, but keep the RSS feed.
Right. Podcasters Roundtable round 50, I believe. Joshua Rivers was on that one. He pointed that out yesterday in the chat.
But then there are the other aspects of rebranding, like maybe you want to spin off a different show, or maybe you want to redesign something. Maybe I'm redesigning my site right now and changing some of my branding, but it's still going to be the same kind of podcast. So what are some of your thoughts, guys, on rebranding what you have?
I think for me, I did something stupid. I had
and this is where you're going to learn, people. So pay attention.
I approached a guy who was kind of a bigwig coach. He's a coach of coaches, and I approached him about.
Did he want to light you on fire?
No, or ignite me in any way. So I approached him. I actually bought his book and said I would like to help you start a podcast, and no strings attached. And then if somewhere down the road, if somebody someday in the future asks you, hey, how did you get into podcasting? Please just mention my name. That was the deal. And at the bottom it said Dave Jackson, personal podcast coach. Well, this guy was not only not interested in starting a podcast and explained how many Bentleys he had in the garage and get away from me, you peasant, but he explained that I was going to go nowhere calling myself a personal podcast coach. And I grabbed any tail and anything else I could find and tuck it between my legs and walk away. And so I was like, I can't go anywhere being a personal podcast coach. So for like 3 weeks, I was your professional podcast consultant. and it didn't roll off the tongue. It doesn't, to me, I am personal. That's the whole point. It's personal podcast. I feel like I'm a coach. I don't know if there's I know there's supposedly a difference between a coach and a consultant or whatever, but I was like, I've got 400 episodes calling myself personal podcast coach, and after about 4 weeks, I went, this is stupid. I'm a personal podcast coach. It's what I feel like, and so I just went back, and nobody punched me in the face, but that's the good news. But that was something I tried.
Dave just did a call out to an inside joke branded Ryan Parker.
That's right, foodcraftsman.com.
No one's going to punch you in the face. Made famous in an interview with Dave Jackson.
And if I have a T-shirt with that slogan on it to wrap it all in.
Hey, and that's what I thought of when you say that. Back in the day, that's Dave. Where's your back in the day shirt?
For me, I think when you change your brand and it no longer feels like you, or you're uncomfortable, or if it changes, that's when you go, not really sure. So, and sometimes that may lead to your demise. I just watched. I've binge watching Bar Rescue. If you've ever watched that show, and there was a guy that had a hookah bar, and the guy came in and worked his magic mojo, and the bar was tremendous, but the guy really wanted a hookah bar, so he turned it back into a hookah bar, and it went. So sometimes following what you want to do may not be the best idea, but hey, it's your podcast. You got to do what you want to do.
That's the beauty of podcasts. There's pretty much low overhead if you want it to be, and you can do whatever you want. And so it's just who wants to come along for the ride.
Yeah. And then Brandy has a great point. She says, test the waters with your audience before starting the rebrand and see how big the revolt will be. Yeah, I probably should have gone to my Facebook group and said, do you think, personal podcast coach, you think because I know some people just think the word coach just makes them throw up in their mouth just a little bit. And to me, I was like, really? Okay. So I should have probably asked my audience, do you think this is holding me back, in the same way that people love to argue if the name podcasting is holding it back. And I'm pretty sure my audience, because they're my audience, probably would have said, no, what are you talking about? But I took the advice of some very rich man and who was rude.
What other elements, when we're talking about podcast and building our brand, and again, I'm really interested in the, okay, we'll get to that.
I have a good example.
Here's the beauty of video is visual cues. Yes. Dave's arms just went up, double-fisted.
That's the signal.
It's the signal. Go, Dave.
And it's a problem I have to this day. I have lost business.
Do we have rant music? We need music cues in here.
I've lost business because of a lovely thing called typos, and that is part of your brand. And I even have systems now in place to run multiple spell checks. My problem is I'm typing up my show notes hours before I release them, and if I would do it, if I would just move everything back a day and come back and look at it with fresh eyes, I probably wouldn't have that problem. But it's something. My favorite is when I have a typo because you don't spell check the title of your show. You spell check the section. That doesn't make you look stupid at all. So that's one for me that when we were thinking about this episode, I was like, and I don't want to be. I've jokingly said I'm the king of typos, but that's really not what I want on my business card. Here, I'm Dave Jackson, king of typos. That's not really want to be. You want to know me for back in the day and all that stuff, fine, but don't go and having a typo on my tombstone is not what I'm looking for.
I will say there are some big podcasters that consistently put out stuff that it's like really. You even have a team of people, like maybe check that, because it does. I'm like it kind of waters down the brand. I see it as less professional, but especially if you're a professional brand. So it can be important, and it's just funny the stuff that sticks with you. Rick Rivers in the chat says media at email address is a tip that just paid for his investment in this show. Well, we're glad, Rick, because this is not a cheap community to be a part of. That's cool. So Rick already got value. He's probably out of here. Thanks for joining us, Rick. So what else? I mean, there's, when you're starting a podcast, you're deciding all these things that are kind of going to set your brand from here until whenever your podcast stops. Now, it doesn't have to. The beauty is we are in control of that, and I can make this t-shirt, right? Roman could change to red, but the blue I've kind of decided. So you're picking colors, you're picking graphics and design. Like, is there any pressure, or is it just like, hey, you can change that? I mean, that's part of rebranding. At some point, you're like, oh, I'm going to change everything. The look. My website's had several different looks.
I think it's important that when you have a brand, do think about it. Do try and get the brand as good as you can, but you grow up. I mean, when you're a kid, you don't try and choose your clothing for when you're going to be in a retirement home. You grow up. You grow up. I think it is good to keep your branding as consistent as possible. And I'm going through a visual rebranding right now. It might even be available online by the time people are listening to this episode on the download. But I am carrying over aspects of that original brand, so it's not such a big shock to people. Colors are different, but a logo is very similar.
And people will go crazy. I mean, look at Instagram. Their logo just changed significantly. Yeah. And it's like you'll get the immediate reaction from most people like, oh, people don't like change, right? But you'll just get used to it and become, But even that icon on your phone, you're like, wait, where's Instagram? Forget it. I won't post a picture, right?
Well, and that's something to think about. As much as we talk about having the brand, most brands do not stay the same forever. I mean, just look at the logo for Pepsi or Coke or, I forget where I was doing training. It might have been Dodge. And they showed all these different logos that were kind of the same but not really the same, going all the way back to the 60s, where they just constantly were changing it and tweaking it just a little bit. So it's not a crime to tweak your brand if you want to do something. I think it was Todd Cochran once that said he changes his artwork every now and then just to kind of keep it fresh on, I think, at the New Media Show or something like that.
My artwork hadn't changed for the Audacity to Podcast will be 5 years old this year. Wow. So this rebranding lines up nicely with the 5-year birthday. That's cool. But it hasn't changed in those 5 years. It's the same artwork since the beginning, but it will change now. And I'm thinking a lot more about it in this rebranding. Like originally I was thinking, I'm going to carry over the same orange and blue colors because people kind of recognize it based on that. But the more I worked with it, the more I realized this just doesn't look right. And it doesn't actually fit the branding that I've had content-wise since the beginning. So watch out for there being red in my cover art. As much as we talk about don't use red, there are good places to use red, and it totally fits with my new branding.
Yeah, I mean, I've changed my logo subtly, where you would only know it if you were kind of an Uber fan. But I've had logos change in my podcast app. Pocket Cast displays logos prominently, and I'm like, hey, you're screwing up my thing here, man. Like, don't change on me. But it just goes to show people, they don't like change, but it'll be okay. Seriously, the content's good. It's not going to. People aren't going to leave. If they're leaving over a logo change,
yeah,
you're good.
To get back to your question about like starting out, I think do what you can. Yeah, put some thought into it. Try and grow into it, or try and keep it around for a while to build that branding. But don't obsess over it. It's like if you have to pay someone only $5 to get some crappy podcast cover art, but that's what it takes for you to launch your podcast, do that, and you can improve it later on. It's more important for you to get your brand out there than for you to spend forever trying to perfect your brand and never get it out there.
Yeah, and that's an important point because a lot of people do that, and it's like, even with a podcast, they want to get it sounding so perfect and everything. And it's like, a year down the road when you finally launched, you're a year behind that you could have been producing content, and you can fix all that. People, if you're making an effort to grow, that's all people care about.
Yeah, Mark Maron.
Yeah, you're gonna
go ahead, Roman.
Yeah, you're gonna grow. Like since 2011 when I started the original blog I set up, I've redone the site maybe 4 times. So that's just as I've gotten better with web stuff and learned better plugins and that kind of stuff, I've redone it. I've basically learned everything from scratch on YouTube or just looking it up, and as far as design, all that kind of stuff goes. And in the end, it all worked out because all the different iterations of my logo for SpiroBlog.com culminated in a nicer logo for the Spiro Nation. Like I had the little diver guy on the side, and then when I switched over from Spiro Blog to Spiro Nation, I was able to use the little diver guy as like the eye in Nation. So like, I mean, it's iterative, right? You got to just improve it a little bit as you go, and just make sure you keep some of the elements in place, like the color theme or like the fonts. That way, it kind of still kind of has the old feeling, but with a more modern look. So that's my advice.
Dave, what were you going to say?
I forget.
Yeah,
I was
that happens.
enthralled with what Roman was saying. I'm just sitting there thinking, yes.
Brandy in the chat said, advice to new podcasters is to pick something that's good enough for now. Keep an eye out toward leveling up. So, and that's really the message here is don't let it get in the way. It's important.
Yeah.
Consider it. Think about it. There are bigger things like the name of your show, right? That can be a pretty big brand choice. In the beginning, a lot of people want to put podcast on the end of their show. I had a show that had podcast on the end, but it actually, in some cases, it fits to define the media type. And for me, it did, especially back in 2007. So, what do you guys think in terms of show names? Now, that can be a tough one because we did talk about sort of keeping things consistent. And when you're picking your show name, one tip is to go see if the domain is available because it can get really tricky. You think in the beginning, that's okay. I'll name my show this, and then the domain's not available, but now you're saying the name of your show in the beginning. It's titled everywhere. And then in the episode, you have to send someone to a URL that is different than all the other branding they're getting.
Right.
And, that's fine. But what you're doing is you are at some point dropping off people who tried to get to you because they got confused or didn't remember. I think that there's some cost to that. Or there's being cute with your name too, right? What do you guys think about now? Roman, you got what? The Spear? What's the name of the podcast? It's The Spear, right?
It's The Spear, right.
So,
correct.
People they don't exactly know what they're going to get. If I just see The Spear in iTunes title, the artwork might help out. But, there are considerations there.
Yeah, that's true. So, I added fishing podcast to the end of the name just so, to the actual title. And yeah, as far as for which URLs to go to, I went ahead and just it's such a unique sport that I went ahead and grabbed all the URLs that had to do with it. So the Spear podcast, Spearfishing podcast, I have all the generic versions of it. So yeah, that's kind of the route I went. But yeah, I think it should have. I also added a bunch of descriptive words as far as fishing and spearfishing into the title and into my author tag to help it rank. So
I think that one of the kind of misunderstood points from Edison Research and Tom Webster, but I think he does have a partially valid point here, is talking about your show as a podcast. That okay, let's put aside, I'm not talking about let's rename the industry to something other than podcast, audio on demand. No, I'm not talking about that. In his latest presentation, the Podcast Consumer Survey of 2016, I think he had a really good method of presenting this. He said, let's take This American Life, for example. If you listen to that through the radio, you're listening to a radio show. If you listen to it through iTunes, you're listening to a podcast, but it's the same show. If you listen to it through Pandora, then what is it? It's not a radio show. It's not a podcast. It's still a show. So I think that for us as branding, I think we should talk about that we host shows or we create shows, and we should try and avoid using the word podcast in our branding, but we can still tell people it's available as a podcast and then explain what a podcast is, that kind of thing. But if you limit yourself to using the word podcast, you are limiting yourself. What if someday you're on a platform with that same content, but it's not a podcast? Then you have to change your name. You have to rebrand.
Yeah, when you tell somebody it's a show, you don't have to explain what that means. Typically.
And that's changed, right? This is an evolution. This is a thing that has changed. We've been in the space since pretty much the beginning, most of us. And so this has changed. Before it was a podcast, it was very specific. Like, this is where you get it. Podcasts are available at iTunes, and, there was a barrier there to getting podcasts. It was hard, or it's like, where do I find you? So this, I think it's a definite evolution. And in the beginning, it was more important to be defined as a podcast because then it was easier to know exactly what you were. And now, yes, it's a delivery method, it's a technology, but people understood it, and they still understand it. I think even more so, they understand what a podcast is. More people know. So when you say, I have a podcast, they pretty much assume, I'm guessing, that you have an audio show that's available on the internet, right? I mean, they get it. Like, whereas before, I have a podcast. You should probably go to a doctor and get that cut off, right? I mean, people didn't know, so.
Or as the local post office said when I got a P.O. box and I told him what the P.O. box name was supposed to be, he said, "A podcast? Right. What's that?"
So it's changed. Just like your show will change, the medium has even changed. And while I agree, I've always used show synonymously with podcasts, that it's changed and as we grow as a medium. But I do think, as even things like an industry changes, that may actually dictate some of what you do with your own brand. So, just be able to go with it, I think, is probably important. To be flexible, to change things when needed.
Yep. Going back to your thing about names, I always joke and say I'm like one of the greatest examples of a horrible name. I named my show The Morning Announcements because it was the School of Podcasting. Get it?
I never called you that. Your branding. I always, in fact, I didn't even know. I was like, there was some confusion there in the beginning, but I just referred. And thank goodness, I could type in the School of Podcasting into the web browser and get to where I wanted to go. Right. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to find you unless you came up in a search. Because I did. I never even knew you as that name.
Yeah, so it was always kind of silly, and I've since dropped that. But it's one of those, I always tell people, pick your name, go to your target audience and say, I'm starting a podcast. It's called blank, and then see if they tell you what the content's about. And if they do, I think that's a good name in my opinion. It's or if you have to spell the name, you've picked a bad name. If there are hyphens in your URL, you probably could have looked for something else, because that's just things you're going to hate later when you go, oh, it's the School of Podcasting, it's school-of-podcasting. You're going to want to kill yourself about the 900th time you have to do that.
Well, no one's going to type that in, and I think for me that's the real key. Is like someone listens to your show every week. The one thing they remember is either your name, right? They're like, oh, you know what? I want to go find out about that guy that was on his show, and they're not going to go to the app and maybe find a link. They're going to type in Dave Jackson, or they're going to type in School of Podcasting. And the question is, can they find you? From the two strongest things out of your brand, I hope they can find you from that. Because we know on the internet, you have like one shot and then people just give up and move on, right? There's something else to look at. Ooh, cat video.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, I feel like, seriously, I think we cracked the top of this issue open. We talked about like artwork and titles and Twitter handles, all the stuff that you really kind of decide in the beginning. Again, decide, move on, grow. But I feel like there's just like we haven't even got into the middle and the end, and it feels like much more. So, as always, we can bring stuff back up here on the Roundtable. And if you are on the Roundtable and you're dying, like 3 months ago you guys talked about this, I have to talk about it now that I'm finally on the Roundtable. Please bring it up. But in order to do that, you have to go to podcastersroundtable.com/guest. And so if you only remember one part, if you don't remember the slash, you should hopefully by now you know podcastersroundtable.com, or you only have to type in Podcasters Roundtable. Maybe you type in Ray Ortega or Dave Jackson. I wonder if Dave and Daniel, if you guys rank for the Roundtable. Maybe just Daniel Roundtable? How does that rank? How does Daniel Roundtable?
Right now.
You get some weird results with that one. But anyways, podcastersroundtable.com/guest. You can sign up. I see Daniel's nodding his head.
First page of Google. It's number like 8 or 9. Podcasters Roundtable.
Completely intentional branding. Totally worked. That's awesome. That's great news. I'm scared to type in do you rank better for this show than I do? Is a good question. Also, how does that? Are you in a private mode? That gets weird, right?
Ray Roundtable, Podcasters Roundtable is number 1 result.
Hey,
and the iTunes link is number 3.
Hey, we're doing something right. All right. Well, I hope when we have a whole roundtable about branding that we're actually doing something okay here, and you can grab little pieces of advice, take it back to your show. That's the whole point. But you guys have anything left to say? It's cool. Go ahead, but let us know where we can find your brand. And thanks for joining us once again, Daniel. Co-hosting job well done.
Thank you. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from the Podcast.com. Watch for my upcoming visual rebranding. The content won't change. The music won't change. The format of the show won't change. It's the visual rebranding I'm doing. I think you'll notice something that's always been hidden in the logo, but you might not have noticed it before. It's now a lot more prominent. That's at Podcast.com, launching soon.
Yeah, and if you see something over there and you want to have a question about why Daniel did that, definitely get in touch with him and talk about branding or talk about whatever you want. Just talk about podcasting. Daniel has all the answers that you need. And I kind of make a joke. I said, co-hosting duties, job well done. As far as Podcasters Roundtable, Dave, what do they call us, man? I mean, I started it. I brought you on as co-host, but really, there's no separation between hosts here. It's us three. Right? I mean, people know it that way.
I know Jason Bryan calls us the tripods.
Right, the tripods. Thank you. Right? Like, the Podcasters Roundtable has become, I think, the three of us, and then we always bring on a new person. But the brand sort of worked itself out, I think. And apparently Google thinks so as well. But Dave, thanks for joining us once again.
Yeah, Dave Jackson from the School of Podcasting. The thing I was going to mention earlier, and this is what we're talking about, you can change things later. Mark Maron, when he started his WTF show, he was using illegal AC/DC music.
Nice.
It was a song called Livewire. Used to be his intro. So you can change things later. I don't know if that was forced upon him or not, but
I'm sure.
Yeah,
especially when you get popular.
Yeah, you can always change your music, your logo, things like that. So this was fun.
Dave Jackson, schoolofpodcasting.com.
Yes.
Is that good?
That's it.
All right. Roman, thanks again for being the new roundtabler. And
this is fun.
Yeah.
This is awesome. So I want to give one tip for guys or guys and gals that are doing their show. I would run my show's Twitter account and a separate personal account. It's easier to keep things separate, and then what I'm doing is I run all of my show through the Spirit Nation account, and then I do personal stuff, so behind the scenes stuff, kind of like letting your audience get to know you better on my personal account. That's just the way I do it, and so far it's working out pretty well. Again, my name is Roman Castro. I host the Spear podcast. It's you can go to my page with all information. It's spironation.com. I almost forgot.
Awesome. And, that kind of brings it full circle to where we started with this question, because I was kind of curious about how, when, podcasting is more personal, and why not, I think your audience of your show is very interested in knowing more details about you. Some maybe, some not. I also have a personal Twitter account where I talk about anything that's really not podcasting, or, I tweet a lot when the San Francisco Giants play, and my podcast helper, they don't want to know that. And, maybe once in a while, I will say that on Podcast Helper, once in a while, the Giants won the World Series 3 times in the last 5 years, just saying, hashtag ring. But, but I will say, so when that happens, that's a big moment. I might show me celebrating on Instagram, and I'll put that out there, right? It's a personal touch into a feed for the podcast where people get to know you a little bit better. And I think social media is so cool because in those gaps between the podcast, which may be, once a week, it's really a place to connect and get additional content about, and people don't have to follow you there. So I am still very interested in that whole separation between personal and quote unquote professional, or your brand. But, so if you guys have, if you, here's the thing, instead of cracking open another 25 minutes of conversation, let me know, let us know. We don't even have a hashtag for this, but let us know. Get in touch, tweet it out. Let us know what you do. Do you separate your personal from your podcast or your brand? Do you have 2 Twitter accounts? Hashtag PR brand. I don't know, just making it up. Now I have to go put that column in my tweet deck. Good job. Oh, man, more work. All right, you guys. Podcaster Roundtable 73. Make sure to come back for 74, one of my favorite numbers. If I keep saying that, it'll become part of my brand. Everyone will see the number 74 and they'll think Roundtable. Awesome. We'll see you later. Wave goodbye. We're out of here.